The racist flight attendant slapped a black man on a flight, not knowing who he truly was. Before diving into the story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. It all began on what seemed like a routine trip from Miami to Washington. The cabin was alive with the usual pre-flight commotion, luggage being crammed into overhead bins, passengers shifting and settling into their seats, and the steady hum of the engines rolling beneath it all. In the middle of it, there sat Daniel. Dressed sharply in his late 30s, Daniel had a quiet presence, the kind that comes from confidence. He found his window seat, sat down, and prepared for the hours ahead. It wasn't like Daniel was particularly thrilled to be on this flight. It was just another journey in the endless cycle of work, family, and life obligations. He closed his eyes for a moment, settling into the familiarity of travel, letting the sound of the engines drown out the rest of the noise. He just wanted a peaceful journey, a few quiet hours to reflect, or maybe catch up on some rest. The flight attendant, Ellen, was making her rounds in the aisle, but it wasn't hard to miss her impatience. From the start, her movements were hurried, sharp. She huffed as she assisted with luggage, snapped directions at passengers, and offered little in the way of warmth. Daniel didn't pay her much mind at first. He knew how stressful their job could be, and people have bad days. So when he politely asked for some water before the plane took off, he expected a quick nod or a promise to bring it soon. But Ellen's reaction caught him off guard. She glanced at him quickly, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening. She muttered something dismissive, and it was clear she wasn't going to get him water anytime soon. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, figuring maybe she would bring it around later. But something about the way she looked at him, that glare, stayed with him. It was as if she saw him as an inconvenience, an annoyance she had to endure. It wasn't right, but Daniel had faced worse. He was used to brushing off rudeness, even when it was clearly directed at him. As the plane filled up and began preparing for takeoff, Ellen's demeanor didn't improve. In fact, she seemed to grow more agitated, and Daniel couldn't help but notice she was only like this with certain passengers, particularly those who, like him, were black. He kept watching as she brusquely handed out instructions, scolding people who were taking too long to settle in, and ignoring the needs of those who asked for her attention. She moved past Daniel again, completely avoiding eye contact, and refused to acknowledge him. Something was off. Daniel couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. He felt like he was being targeted, but he tried to keep his cool. He thought maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe she really was just having a bad day. He shifted in his seat, trying to focus on other things. The view outside, the in-flight magazine, anything to avoid making a scene. But the tension lingered, and he could feel it hanging in the air like a thick fog. The flight began smoothly enough. Passengers had settled in, seatbelts were fastened, and the plane soared into the sky. But Ellen's attitude didn't improve. Every time she passed Daniel, she seemed to throw him a sharp look, as if daring him to speak up or cause trouble. He stayed silent, hoping it would all just blow over. But then things escalated. Midway through the flight, Daniel politely asked for water again, trying to make his request as non-intrusive as possible. It should have been a simple ask, but Ellen snapped at him, telling him to wait until she was ready. The way she said it, loudly with hostility, caught the attention of other passengers. Daniel felt their eyes on him, felt the embarrassment rising. He couldn't believe she would speak to him like that. But still, he stayed calm. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be the angry black man she seemed to expect him to be. But Ellen wasn't done. She continued to accuse him of being disruptive, of bothering the staff, even though he'd only asked for water. The passengers around him were shifting uncomfortably, whispering to each other, wondering what was going on. And then it happened. Without warning, Ellen slapped Daniel across the face. The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the cabin, and all at once, everything went silent. Daniel's cheek burned from the slap, but he didn't move. He didn't rise from his seat or shout back. He didn't give her the reaction she wanted. He just sat there, stunned, the entire cabin around him in shock. Phones were up, people were recording, but Daniel kept his composure. He didn't want to give her any reason to paint him as a threat, even though he could see the fear in her eyes as she took a step back. She expected him to explode, to lash out, but he didn't. He just looked at her, calmly, and that seemed to anger her even more. Daniel's eyes caught something: Ellen's tattoo. On her wrist, barely visible, was an intricate tattoo of an eagle. But it wasn't just any tattoo. It looked like it had been modified, covered up to mask its original design. The lines and shading seemed fresh, as if they were done recently. And suddenly a chill ran down Daniel's spine. He didn't know exactly why, but something about that tattoo didn't sit right with him. Ellen, sensing the attention of the passengers and not knowing how to regain control, stormed off to the front of the plane. Moments later, she announced over the speaker that they were bringing in security to remove a disruptive passenger. It was clear she meant Daniel. He couldn't believe it. All he had done was ask for water, and now he was being treated like a criminal. He felt helpless, felt like he was caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As the plane descended to make an emergency landing, Daniel prepared for the worst. He knew what could happen next: being dragged off the plane, humiliated in front of everyone. But then something he didn't expect happened. The other passengers began to speak up. They stood up for him, told the flight crew that Daniel had done nothing wrong, that it was Elon who had been aggressive and violent. People were filming, shouting, demanding that Daniel not be removed. By the time the security guards came on board, it wasn't Daniel they were looking to take off. It was Ellen. The flight attendant was escorted off the plane, bewildered and defiant. Another attendant came in to replace her, and the tension in the cabin finally eased. Daniel sat there trying to process everything. The other passengers around him offered their support, reassured him that he wasn't crazy, that they'd all seen how horribly Ellen had acted. For the first time, Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't imagining the hatred or the discrimination, and he wasn't going to let it end there. After the chaotic scene on the plane, Daniel was left trying to make sense of what had just happened. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, his cheeks still stung from the slap, and his mind was racing with a mix of anger and disbelief. The passengers around him continued to murmur their support, offering words of comfort and outrage on his behalf. He was grateful, but his thoughts were somewhere else: on Ellen, the slap, and that strange tattoo on her wrist. The rest of the flight passed in a strange blur. The replacement flight attendant, a middle-aged man who clearly knew how to handle tension, moved quickly to restore some semblance of order. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the tattoo he saw meant something more than just a poorly covered piece of body art. He had seen tattoos get modified before, but this one looked like it was meant to conceal something significant, as if she wanted to erase a part of her past. And now Daniel was determined to find out why. When they landed in Washington, the passengers filed off the plane in an uneasy silence. But Daniel's resolve was growing. He exchanged contact details with a few of the passengers who had come to his defense, and they reassured him that they would back him up if he chose to take things further. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about the blatant prejudice, the abuse of power, and the fact that it had all happened because Ellen decided he wasn't worthy of basic respect. Before Daniel even left the airport, he contacted the airline's customer service, demanding a full report of the incident and assurances that something would be done. He insisted that the videos from other passengers be reviewed and that a proper investigation be conducted into Ellen's actions. As expected, the airline tried to appease him with apologies and vague promises of disciplinary action. But Daniel wasn't going to let this get brushed under the rug. He wanted more than just an apology. He wanted answers. That night, Daniel sat in his hotel room, trying to unwind from the day's events. He replayed the confrontation over and over in his head. But one detail stood out: that tattoo. He remembered how it looked: a dark eagle, crudely covered by vines and floral patterns, hastily shaded to hide whatever was underneath. It wasn't something done for beauty. It was a cover-up, done to erase something that wasn't meant to be seen anymore. But why? He searched online, trying to find any connection between the tattoo and something more sinister. It wasn't easy. He went down rabbit holes of images, old forums, and obscure references. He was about to give up when he stumbled across something that made his skin crawl. A picture of a tattoo, almost identical to the one on Ellen's wrist, but without the cover-up. It was a symbol linked to a far-right racist group called the Nation Protectors, known for their hatred and discriminatory beliefs, particularly against Black people and other minorities. The tattoo, before it was concealed, was unmistakable, and now it all made sense. Daniel's heart sank as he realized the depths of what he had encountered. Ellen's actions weren't just about having a bad day or being stressed. It was about hatred. She wasn't just rude, she was part of something deeply rooted in racism. And she had tried to cover her tracks, literally and figuratively, by hiding her past affiliation with a new tattoo. It explained her hostility, the rage with which she slapped him, and the way she quickly tried to accuse him of being the aggressor. The whole thing was designed to provoke a reaction, to reinforce whatever racist beliefs she held. The anger Daniel felt was overwhelming, but he knew he had to stay calm, to think things through. He had a choice. Let this moment pass, another case of racial bias to add to the many others, or take a stand and make sure it didn't happen again. He knew the risks involved. Calling out discrimination on such a public scale would mean media attention, backlash, and potentially a long battle with the airline and its policies. But Daniel wasn't just any passenger. He was someone with the means to make a difference. Someone who could use his voice to shine a light on what had happened and demand real change. He decided to reach out to the airline with everything he had gathered. He included the details of the incident, the videos taken by passengers, and the discovery of the tattoo. He made it clear that he wasn't going to back down until they took real action to address what had happened. And more than that, he wanted assurances that policies would be put in place to prevent such racist behavior in the future. The next few days were a whirlwind. As word of the incident spread, the story went viral online. The videos of Ellen's slap, her aggressive behavior, and the supportive passengers standing up for Daniel were shared thousands of times. The public outcry was fierce. People demanded justice for Daniel and accountability from the airline. It wasn't just about one bad flight attendant. It was about the systemic issues that allowed someone like her to act on her prejudice without fear of consequences. Daniel's inbox was flooded with messages, some from well-wishers, others from people sharing their own stories of discrimination in everyday life. But what surprised him most were the messages from Ellen's former colleagues, people who claimed to have worked with her in the past and described similar patterns of behavior. They said she'd always had a chip on her shoulder, a deep-seated disdain for certain passengers, and a tendency to take things too far. But it wasn't until that slap, until she crossed that line, that her actions were finally exposed for what they were. The airline couldn't ignore the backlash. They released a public statement condemning Ellen's actions and announcing that she had been terminated from her position. But Daniel wasn't done. He wanted more than a dismissal. He wanted a conversation. He demanded to speak directly with the airline's executives, to talk about their training, their policies, and how they could ensure that no one else would ever be treated the way he was. And finally, after days of back and forth, he got what he wanted: a meeting. An opportunity to sit down face to face with the people who had the power to make a real difference. Daniel knew this meeting wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. It was a chance to push for change, to make sure that what happened on that flight was more than just a viral moment. It was the start of something bigger. But as Daniel prepared for that meeting, he couldn't shake the lingering question: how many more Ellens were out there? How many more people, hiding behind modified tattoos and forced smiles, were carrying the same hatred she had? And how could he make sure that this was just the beginning of a much-needed change? The morning of the meeting, Daniel felt a mix of nerves and resolve. He knew the meeting was more than just a personal battle. It was about taking a stand against something bigger than himself. He was preparing to speak not just for his own experience, but for all those who'd faced prejudice and discrimination in their daily lives. He dressed sharply, straightened his tie, and went over his notes one last time. He'd done his research, prepared every detail, and knew exactly what points he wanted to make. Today wasn't about a confrontation. It was about making sure things changed for the better. The airline's headquarters were in a gleaming high-rise downtown, and as Daniel walked through the entrance, he felt the weight of the task ahead. The security guard at the front desk handed him a badge and directed him to the top floor, where the executives were waiting for him in a conference room. The elevator ride was silent, the seconds ticking by like hours, and Daniel's thoughts raced with everything he wanted to say. By the time the doors opened, he was ready. Inside the conference room, Daniel was met by a small group of airline representatives, a few executives in crisp suits, a lawyer sitting quietly in the corner, and the head of customer relations. They greeted him with polite smiles, but Daniel could see the tension behind their eyes. They knew how serious this was. They knew the eyes of the world were on them now, thanks to the videos that went viral and the attention Daniel's case had attracted. The head of customer relations began the meeting with an apology. He acknowledged that Ellen's behavior was unacceptable, that it didn't align with the airline's values, and that she'd been fired as a result. But Daniel was quick to push past the formalities. It wasn't just about firing one person. It was about addressing the culture that allowed someone like Ellen to behave like that without fear of consequences. He wanted to know how the airline planned to prevent something like this from happening again. Daniel laid out his concerns clearly and directly. He talked about Ellen's pattern of behavior, how she targeted certain passengers based on their race, and how the airline's current training clearly hadn't done enough to stop her from acting on her prejudices. He presented the videos from the flight, the statements from other passengers, and even the messages from Ellen's former colleagues, who corroborated her long-standing hostility toward minorities. Daniel wanted to see real change, policies that would protect passengers from discrimination, mandatory bias training for all employees, and a public commitment to fostering a culture of respect and inclusion. The executives nodded as he spoke, and Daniel could tell they were taking him seriously. They agreed to implement more robust training programs, to better screen their staff, and to improve their policies to ensure the safety and dignity of all passengers. But as the conversation continued, Daniel knew he couldn't let go of the issue of the tattoo. It was more than just a personal grudge. It was about uncovering the truth behind Ellen's motivations. He brought up the tattoo, showing them the images he'd found online of the Nation Protector's symbol. The executives exchanged uneasy glances as he explained how the original tattoo, associated with a far-right racist group, had been hastily covered up. Daniel demanded to know how someone with such affiliations had been allowed to work in such a public-facing role. Was there no vetting process? No background checks? The room went quiet for a moment, and Daniel could see the unease on their faces as they realized just how deeply this incident cut. The head of customer relations promised to conduct a thorough investigation, both into Ellen's background and the hiring practices that allowed her to join the airline in the first place. They agreed to review their vetting process and ensure that anyone with ties to hate groups would not be allowed to work for the company. But Daniel knew that promises were only as good as the actions behind them. He made it clear that he would be watching closely, that he expected real change, and that he wouldn't hesitate to go public again if those promises weren't kept. The meeting ended on a tense but hopeful note. Daniel shook hands with the executives, thanking them for their willingness to listen and work toward a solution. They assured him that they would be transparent about their progress, keeping him updated on the steps they were taking. But as he left the building, Daniel felt a sense of both victory and responsibility. He'd won this battle, but the war against prejudice and discrimination was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the airline did make good on their word. They launched a comprehensive review of their hiring and training practices, bringing in outside consultants to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts. They rolled out new policies to address racial bias, ensuring that all staff underwent extensive training to understand and respect passengers from all backgrounds. And they issued a public statement condemning racism and committing to creating a safer, more inclusive environment for everyone who flew with them. Daniel stayed involved, working closely with the airline as they implemented these changes. He became a voice for other passengers who had faced similar experiences, advocating for fair treatment and respect across the board. He reached out to community organizations, speaking about his experience, using it as an example of how to confront prejudice head-on and drive change from within. But Daniel didn't stop there. The more he learned about the nation protectors and their reach, the more determined he became to expose their ideology and fight against it. He worked with advocacy groups to bring awareness to the symbols, the beliefs, and the tactics that hate groups use to spread their message. He knew that one flight attendant's tattoo was just a small part of a much larger issue, and he wanted to make sure that people like Ellen couldn't hide behind modified ink and a forced smile. Daniel's experience became a catalyst for change, both in the airline industry and beyond. Media outlets picked up on the story, interviewing him about what it felt like to be targeted for simply being who he was. He spoke candidly about the fear, the anger, but also the hope. The hope that came from seeing strangers stand up for him, from knowing that people were willing to come together to fight against hate. He shared the message that standing up against prejudice isn't just the responsibility of those who experience it, it's the responsibility of everyone who witnesses it. As time went on, Daniel's story continued to resonate. The videos from the plane became a rallying cry for change, and his actions sparked conversations in places that had long been silent about issues of race and discrimination. And while the journey was far from over, Daniel knew that he'd taken the first step toward a world where someone like Ellen couldn't hide behind her prejudices, and where people could travel without fear of being treated as less than. The flight from Miami to Washington may have started with a slap, but it ended with a message, one of strength, unity, and the power of standing up against hate with dignity and purpose. And now Daniel asks himself and others, how can we, individually and collectively, ensure that we confront prejudice in our everyday lives? How do we use our voices to stand up for others when it matters most? It's a question that demands more than just thought. It demands action. And Daniel knew that if this experience taught him anything, it's that real change starts with the courage to speak up. I am curious to know your thought. Have you ever witnessed or experienced prejudice in a situation where speaking up felt risky? How did you respond, and what do you think it takes to stand up against discrimination when you're afraid of the consequences? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video. See you soon for another real-life story.